Kevin, your book, Emergence for Life, Not Fall from Grace, is absolutely centrally focused on the issue of the central Christian story of fall and redemption. What's wrong with that story?
Could I just preclude that by just one thing? By focusing on that, I am aware that I'm talking more about Western Christianity. Secondly, I'm also aware of all the other great religions. But just background, one of the motivations was increasingly, I've been over 60 years almost as teacher and 40 years of working with all kinds of groups. And more I'm finding many Christians are just having access to lots of information now on internet and that, and are moving away from the reality of that story. And so the other thing is, of course, we all know that the Genesis story was a sacred myth and so on. But the problem was it was taken literally, even though some people say, oh, we knew it was that. If you look at the liturgy and lots of experiences and references, it was a literal thing, and certainly the Catholic Church, it's there. So basically, you all know the story, and I won't bore you with that one, that there was a first parents and a universal sin was committed, and then after a certain time, Jesus came along and lived and died and redeemed us, and the church continues that redemption story. Now, there are obviously a lot of problems, I won't go in detail, but a lot of people say, gosh, did God have it in for humanity? That's one, a simple act of forgiveness, an obvious thing. Secondly, paleontologists tell us there are all sorts of different hominids that emerged. There wasn't just one couple. There are many different strands that emerged as Homo sapiens, the person we have today. Thirdly, it was exiled from the garden. There was a whole problem about us as being integrated into the dynamics of the world. Fourthly, it gave a setting, and this was very important, which is strong in the Old Testament, of sin. And if I could just go a bit further, that was compounded after 400 years, when we had the doctrine of original sin, which is a major problem. First of all, it was never in the 400 years of the church that we're born ontologically in sin. Secondly, common sense would tell you when you hold a child in your arms, you know that child is capable of altruism, doing good, and also doing evil. Why did we focus saying the child is born in sin? Thirdly, Augustine said it was transmitted by the act of intercourse for conception. What did they say about a whole integrated process of sexuality and so on? Fourthly, it led to a distortion of baptism, of taking away sin instead of an initiation to the community, so you have limbo and all that stuff. And I won't go into all that. But I'm just illustrating this as a problem, that when you lock yourselves into something like original sin, and then it was made confirmed at the Council of Orange in 529, and the Council of Trent was absolute, put it there as an absolute. It's a don't touch doctrine. And then you paint yourself into a corner doctrinally with something that was trying to express something, the reality of sin in the world. Only a fool would deny that. But it had a whole bias. And so the problem of setting the Genesis story in such a way as a context for the Jesus story, who became the Christ, switches the thing. So in my book I was trying to say, look, we have to understand the symbolism and all that there. Why not just shift the emphasis a bit? Instead of saying Jesus was picking up a plan that went wrong, God had to bring in plan B because his first plan didn't work. Why not think about the heart of the gospel, John 10:10, I've come that you may have life and have it in abundance. Life in abundance for self, psychologically, spiritually, physically, and so on. Abundance of life for others and a common good and so on. and also a life in abundance for the creation. So instead of being a restoration thing, of picking up of a purported thing that went wrong at the beginning, why not think about the Jesus story, who became the Christ, as a regeneration of calling us to life? You see, and I'll just finish on this point because there's so much I'd like to say, but that it's always got to be a religion, as I understand it, grounded in life. And which one of us, thinking about the refugees, 43 million of them are displaced in the world today. 15,000 children die of cholera drinking water today, and so on. And all those issues. Where is life? And so the Jesus story, surely redemption, salvation, of course. But salvation, remember, doesn't mean life, what happens after death. If you look at the word salvation, it means healing, bringing towards wholeness. Redemption has the same meaning, bringing something that's not right into wholeness. And I'll just stop there, but it's an important shift, I think. Otherwise, that's why science and religion are so important. Part of my book was to try and say, look, they're not opposites. They start with different assumptions, but there's a whole togetherness that we can, provided we know. And we have to rescue Jesus from biblical literalism.
Okay.
Sorry.
On the literalism point, very briefly, we'll come back and open up some of those ideas. But a couple of interesting quick points, David. Biblical literalism is one of the things that's running through Kevin's book. It strikes me as something that no one pays attention to. Look, Catholics in particular don't pay attention to. The story of the fall and the atonement that's been superimposed upon the Genesis myth is an allegory. So that at the very centre of the Christian story is an allegorical interpretation of the Bible.
Exactly.
That's then taken literally.
Yes, exactly. The puzzle, Stephen, for me has always been why is it that we've known for so many years that the creation story is an allegory or a sacred myth, and yet I think, as Eugene said before, so many Catholics world over do not see it as a story, but read it as some sort of historical account. Let me just give you one example of this. On ABC television Q&A, George Pell versus Richard Dawkins, which, by the way, I thought Pell won quite easily that debate. They were talking about the creation story, and Dawkins expected Pell to adopt the view, because Dawkins isn't, of course, a practicing Christian, and he doesn't know what practicing Christians think. Dawkins expected Pell to adopt the view that it was an historical account, which then Dawkins, with his clever mindedness, would come in and knock over, another straw man thing. Pell surprised him, pulled the rug out from under him by saying, no, of course it's not an historical account, it's a sacred story told for theological reasons. So, in other words, several popes have said this, Pope Paul, Pope John Paul, and I think what Kevin says in his recent book is it's surprising that there's no reference to evolution in the Catholic Catechism. So, in other words, you've got one hand of the Catholic Church, including popes and archbishops and cardinals, saying one thing. You've got the other hand of the Catholic Church, the Catechism, not making any reference to the fact that this is a symbolic allegory. And naturally, Catholics are very confused about the situation.
Even though John Paul II himself said evolution is more than just a theory. I mean, he really gave his imprimatur to it. But someone as conservative as John Paul II.
So could I just make another little brief point, and that is the extent to which this has been superimposed on a Judaic story that has nothing to do with fall and redemption. I'm just picking up on a point you were making, Kevin. The great Harold Bloom, again, the great literary critic, talks about the promise at the centre of Judaism is always more life. That's when Jacob wrestles the angel. Harold Bloom comes back to that great Old Testament story of Jacob wrestling the angel, who we don't know if it's God or whether it's an actual angel, all through the night. And at the end, when he hasn't given up and he hasn't won, but he hasn't been vanquished. He asks for the blessing, and the blessing is more life.
Yeah.
You see, the first time in 311 the fall is ever mentioned by Methodius of Olympus, eh? So, and yet my Bible, a recent publication in chapter 3, heads the thing, chapter 3, the fall. Interesting. It gave a whole mindset. And in Judaism, as you're right, and Islam, and there's no fall thing like that. You know?
The other thing that occurs to me is that the Garden of Eden story, and this is something else Harold Bloom says, it's shot through with irony. The J writer who writes that part of the Hebrew Bible is a great one. Is the great ironist in literature, and Harold Bloom's got this great line that Adam and Eve are punished for being children. In other words, the way to read the story and understand it properly is that they've been unfairly dealt with. That's the meaning of the story, and that in a sense to be cast out of Eden is to be cast out of a prison in order to be...
That's right.
They're in prison. And
Can I just pick up one point there? And on a Jungian perspective, I'll mention him just briefly, right, because you mentioned him in your book as well. I would like to read the Genesis narrative, right, particularly in archetypal terms, as an invitation for human beings to take seriously the reality and darkness of the human shadow and to integrate that into an experience of humanness which is totally whole, which incorporates the numinous. Because I think one great danger in some of these discussions is that we can feel that we're lured into embracing some sort of disembodied numinosity rather than allowing ourselves and our picture of God to incorporate the feminine, very important for feminists, expressed in the dogma of the Assumption by Pius XII, the earth, the body, and our very real capacity for evil. To incorporate and to integrate and to know about all of those parts of ourselves is what it is to be fully human and whole, I believe.
Eugene, if you take the fall and the atonement out of the story, what's left?
Well,
I mean, is it viable without that?
yeah, well, if it's an allegory, it's something that can be read on several levels, and I think it was meant to be read at several levels. At one level, yes, it's a story of a sin, a disobedience of our first parents. They wanted the fruit for themselves rather than God giving. At one level, a level of disobedience. At another level, it's got a very Promethean slant about it. In fact, I would be surprised that the story of Prometheus influenced it. These were our first parents reaching out, not to get the fire of the gods, but to get the knowledge of good and evil. And I think it's very instructive that at the end of the story, where God condemns the snake in no uncertain terms, he does not condemn the first parents. He more or less says, you poor buggers, from now on you'll have to work hard and all the rest of it. It's more a kind of a sad saying, well, this is your future, but it's not a condemnation. Also, I think it's instructive that nowhere through the Bible is the story developed in any way, except in Romans 5. Where Paul says, as sin came into the world by one man, so grace came in by another. Now that comparison does not prove that Paul saw the sin of Adam as a sin for the whole of mankind. He could very easily have been expressing an opinion of the time. The whole point of that story is that grace came in by Jesus Christ. That's what he's teaching. So I think it's instructive too that the Celtic Church held strongly that a newborn baby is to the image of God. Some of the fathers developed that further, where man was made to the image and likeness of God. They see that a person is born in the image of God, but then grows to likeness to God. That is probably putting something into the text, but it's interesting the way the fathers developed that. I think that Pelagius probably got a very bad press, mainly because he was fighting Augustine and Jerome. And so he's come down in our history as the arch-heretic. But Pelagius, echoing the Celtic Church, as also Don Scotus Erugena had the similar idea. In fact, the whole of the Eastern Church does not have this idea of original sin. They do have the idea that man is born to the image of God, but it's somehow that image is sort of smothered over a bit, and the smothering has to be cleared away. So it's interesting the way that story has been developed in different circles. I think too, it's as a story of a sin, it's a story of every man. Each one of us can see ourselves as an Adam, and after all, the word Adam is tantamount to
every man.
And it's a story of how we have the choice, we disobey God, and so on. So it's a story to be read at several levels, not univocal.
Kevin, you the subtitle of your book is about how the story of Jesus can be adapted to take into account the theory of evolution. And one of the points you make, I think it's a great little point in relation to the Genesis story, is that one of the things that's incompatible is the idea that the first sin by Adam and Eve brought death into the world, because we know that death is everywhere. Death is a part of natural processes. Just expand on that for us.
Do you mind if I go one step back? I wanted a tree on the front of the book, because the two great trees, symbolical trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And Revelation ends beautifully, we bring those together. And because really I found a great insight in paleontology, the story of origins. And there's a great debate about when, but I finally took between 150,000 and 80,000. And some writers say it could have very quickly, we crossed the threshold from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, person able to language, arts and so on, in the evolution of humankind. Eve, therefore, could be regarded as the first pathfinder. She said, let's take the tree. The movement from static consciousness to we have to toil, we work, and have children in pain and childbirth and so on. We entered the human condition. So death is an integral part of that, of course, and then the abundance of life theme, which is the heart of the gospel, and to my mind everything, and to me it fitted the whole evolution together as the ongoing dynamic of life that we're all part of. And death is that phase that moves us to another realm of existence, and a Christian therefore believe Jesus is the exemplar of the divine and human coming together. And the resurrection is moving us to this phase of a being in another form. It's not an end. So the problem of death, which is a fear, and so many people, and David has written so much about that too in his book, is a way of moving to another way of being. And therefore the resurrection makes sense. When I had a vision of a person at the interment of ashes that was standing and looking down upon us in a beautiful sort of peaceful way. It was a profound vision for me as to what the resurrection would mean, that I was tapping into something that I really didn't understand. And when I went back and read the gospel stories, the story of Emmaus and so on, the stranger, that corresponded so much for my vision of at the interment of the ashes of that person. So the death,
Can I just pick up a point with David that I made right back in the very first conversation we had about the importance of World War I and World War II? Something very important happened, particularly with World War I, I suspect. There was so much death that people stopped being able to believe in purgatory. There were all these young men who were dead and they couldn't be there. It was intolerable. And in a sense, after World War II and the Holocaust, if you believed in this vengeful God that sent people to hell for all eternity, you were actually in effect praying to a concentration camp guard, and that was intolerable.
Well, one person has said if Auschwitz exists, God does not.
But my point is, have developments in the 20th century just pulled all this stuff apart? The idea of atonement and sin and condemnation to hell for all eternity is just, it's actually too much for people to bear. But they actually, perhaps for the first time, well, certainly in recent history, have had an event that's made them concentrate on what the real meaning of condemning people to hell actually involves. And it's just not part of what people can include in a religion anymore.
I think we haven't talked much about Jews in this conversation.
Or women. Or women.
Yeah. For instance, where I live in Melbourne, there's a very large Jewish population. And sometimes I'm asked to address them at the Jewish Museum or Jewish gatherings about what could God mean today, etc. And I've found to my kind of astonishment, and yet not in another way, that many educated Jews, indeed most educated Jews in my country, do not believe in God because of the Holocaust, because of the effect of World War II, because their theology couldn't answer the levels of atrocity, the levels of evil that were unleashed in the Holocaust. And my heart sort of sorrows for that, because to me, that's not the end of God, that's the beginning of our faith journey, in a sense. I see things like this as challenges to deepen our faith, not actually death sentences to faith. And so I often go into debate with people, both Jews and Christians, who have lost their faith, and try and get them to a deeper level about what God could mean. What you often find, particularly after the First World War, as you said, where there was massive loss of faith after First World War. Indeed, you could say the whole First World War poetry, from Wilfred Owen right through to D.H. Lawrence, was about the death of God. It was sort of Nietzsche phase 2. Then the Holocaust and the Second World War dealt another blow to the traditional and conventional ideas of God. But to my mind, you see, I'm, I suppose, an eternal optimist. I see these things as challenges, not as defeats. So it's like saying, what could God mean to me in the midst of this catastrophe? And of course, we then turn to someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for instance, who says God doesn't necessarily save us from catastrophe. God suffers with us through catastrophe and helps us cope with catastrophe. And indeed, often through a catastrophe, all we end up with is our faith, rather than having lost our faith. And so that's the kind of way I view it historically, that the 20th century has been, yes, the death knell for a lot of conventional expressions of faith. But to me, it's an opening to deepen faith, to understand that God is not just Clark Kent Superman who can help us answer our petitionary prayers. I'm not particularly interested in petitionary prayer myself. A bit disappointed the other day when one of my daughters said in her school, a Catholic school, all they seem to do is have petitionary prayer. You see, I think we've got to go beyond asking for things.
Do we believe in an afterlife?
Yes.
Yes, I've had
an actual, real,
experience.
physical resurrection, or a...
I think we have to realise that, as far as I know, there's nothing defined, if you want to put it that way. That our ideas of heaven and hell and so on are popular images that we've inherited. But I stand to be corrected, but as far as I know, there's no definition that that hell is forever, for example. There have been saints, for example, who've suggested that after a while then they're all saved and go to heaven. But imagination has worked on this a great deal, but there's very little that we're really bound to believe, if you want that word.
Origen had the idea that there was no one in hell, that in the end we were all saved.
Yeah.
I think that's because he believed in some divine spark that after we died went back.
Uh-huh.
But there's a view called universalism that says that in the end everyone is saved.
Yeah.
And there have been times I've thought with the last couple of popes, even John Paul and Benedict at times, Benedict abolishing limbo. There's this faint hint that 20th century Catholicism was groping its way towards a belief, even at the very top, that everyone was basically saved in the end.
I mean, really, all we can say is, I don't know. Julian of Norwich, for example, is famous for
All will be well.
Yes. And you know, it's extraordinary that Julian of Norwich was writing at a time of great turmoil in Europe. She was the first woman to write English literature, and the first woman to write spiritual matters. How she got away with it when the Inquisition was raging on the continent, but she quite blandly came out with that, and no one seemed to pop on her for it.
Could I just make one comment in favour of women and God? I think one of the things that was quite shocking to many Catholics was when Pope Pius XII proclaimed the dogma of the Assumption, which, in terms of a Jungian and someone who's interested in archetypes and symbols, was tantamount to the assimilation of the earth and the feminine into the Godhead, so that you would then have a quaternity rather than a trinity, a more whole concept of God which incorporated the feminine and the earth and the body, and not just this masculine trinity.
I'd like to take that point up. I know we don't give good example for the inclusion of women here, but that's another issue. But unless we recover, if you like, the feminine within God consciousness, we're always going to limp in trying to, I believe, uncover that mystery. And like one of the consequences of Adam and Eve's story, if you like, I'll just Tertullian and so on. You talking about women, you are the devil's gateway. You are the unseal of forbidden fruit and so on. You destroyed the image of God and all that there. So that one of the problems of the misogynist thing, it really surfaced very rapidly. I know there's a whole other big topic which I'm sure we'll go into, but I just want to make a point. I felt there were so many issues we haven't dealt with today that are critical today, and the recovery of the feminine in consciousness is a vital issue today, not just as a kind of thing we do, but critical for any sort of holistic approach to the God consciousness thing.
Thank you.
Breath of Creator, essence of stardust.